There are 1,000 worlds in the Imperium of man that nobody remembers until they start dying. Agrarian backwaters, mining colonies, tithe worlds ground down to their bones by the endless hunger of a civilization at war. Places where human beings are born, suffer, and perish in obscurity, their names never recorded, their sacrifices never acknowledged. The Ministorum has a term for such places. Tertius-grade compliance worlds. Worlds that exist to serve, not to be served. Worlds that the Emperor's light touches only in the most technical, theological sense. Viridia's hope was not supposed to be one of those worlds, and yet, for 300 years, it had been exactly that, until the miracles began. The planet sat at the trailing edge of the Calixis sector, a modest agrarian world of amber fields and slow rivers, its population numbering just over 4 million souls spread across farming settlements, and a single true city, Varus Prime. It produced grain. It paid its tithes, it buried its dead with quiet dignity, and asked nothing of the Imperium in return. The kind of world that Administratum scribes filed away without reading, that Navy cartographers marked with a single pale dot and moved on. Forgettable, functional, faithful in the distant, dutiful way that most Imperial citizens are faithful, reciting the litanies of the departed each morning, not because they felt the Emperor's presence, but because they feared what might fill the silence if they stopped. That changed 83 years ago when a woman named Sarah Valtis walked into the ruins of the old cathedral at the center of Varus Prime and did not come out for 9 days. When she emerged, she was different. Everyone who saw her said so. Not different in the ways that the preachers warned about. Not hollow-eyed or fever-wrecked or babbling heresies. Different in the way a candle is different from a torch. She spoke quietly, but people leaned in to hear her. She touched the sick, and some of them recovered. She stood before the crumbling altar of the ruined cathedral and wept, and when she was done weeping, she began to rebuild. By the time Sarah Valtis died, peacefully in her sleep, at the age of 91, the Cathedral of the Undying Flame dominated the Varus Prime skyline. Its spires reached 300 meters into the pale sky. Its nave could hold 20,000 worshippers. Its bells, cast from reclaimed iron and blessed by 3 successive Ministorum priests, who had each independently reported feeling something vast and warm when they stood at the altar, rang every 6th hour without fail. Pilgrims came from neighboring systems. Healing shrines proliferated in the cathedral's shadow. Children born within earshot of the bells were said to cry less, sleep easier, grow stronger. Viridia's hope became, improbably, a place of genuine devotion. Inquisitor Aldrich Voss of the Ordo Hereticus arrived on a gray morning in the 41st year of the current century, stepping off a Navy courier vessel with 3 acolytes, a sealed case of instruments, and the expression of a man who had learned long ago not to be moved by beauty. He was 64 years old, though he looked 50, tall, lean, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes the color of old iron. He wore a traveling coat of dark gray over his rosette. The inquisitorial seal kept deliberately understated. He had found, over 4 decades of service, that people spoke more freely when they did not immediately recognize what he was. His name had appeared in 11 sector-wide purges, 3 demonic incursions, and 1 event that remained classified at the highest level and which he did not discuss under any circumstances. He had not requested this assignment. It had come to him through a chain of forwarded reports, each one flagged by a different desk-bound analyst, each one individually unremarkable, each one, when read in sequence, forming a pattern that made Voss set down his recaf and sit very still for a long moment before reaching for his travel kit. The reports described Viridia's hope in glowing terms: productivity above tithe expectations, population health statistics that outperformed worlds with dedicated Medicaid infrastructure, crime rates negligible, civil unrest none recorded in 40 years, devotional observance near universal, a perfect world, a content world, a world where everything worked exactly as it should. In Aldrich Voss's experience, worlds like that were the most dangerous kind. His shuttle banked over Varus Prime on approach, and he looked down at the cathedral, at its gleaming spires and the slow procession of pilgrims winding toward its gates, even at this early hour. He watched for a long time without speaking. One of his acolytes, a young woman named Priya, sharp and still learning when to ask questions, leaned toward the viewport beside him. "It's beautiful," she said. "Yes," Voss agreed. He did not look away from the cathedral. His hand, she noticed, had moved unconsciously to the grip of the weapon at his hip. "That's what concerns me." The hospitality of Viridia's hope was, like everything else about the planet, unnervingly perfect. Voss and his acolytes were met at the landing pad by a delegation of 3. A junior Ministorum deacon named Cassell, young and earnest, with ink-stained fingers, and a smile that reached his eyes without apparent effort. A civil administrator named Horath, heavy-set and efficient, who had prepared a full briefing on the colony's infrastructure before Voss had even requested one. And a woman introduced simply as Sister Marin, a lay servant of the cathedral who spoke little but watched everything with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had learned that patience was its own form of power. Voss noted all 3 in the first 30 seconds, filed them, moved on. The city itself demanded attention on its own terms. Varus Prime was not large by Imperial standards, perhaps 600,000 permanent residents, but it was immaculate in a way that unsettled him. Not sterile, not sanitized. It had the texture of a living place, market stalls selling fresh grain bread, children running between the legs of adults on their way to the morning devotions, a pair of elderly men arguing cheerfully over a game of tiles outside a Prometheum-heated tavern. But beneath that texture, an absence. No visible poverty, no beggars at the cathedral steps, no penitents in chains, no preachers screaming damnation at passers-by. In every other Imperial city Voss had ever visited, the Ministorum's presence manifested partly through fear. The reminder that the Emperor's grace was conditional, that sin was always one step behind, that the fires of purgation waited for the complacent soul. It was a theology of the whip as much as the chalice. It kept people moving. It kept them grateful. Here, people moved toward the cathedral the way they might move toward a warm hearth in winter. Not from obligation, not from fear, from want. Priya walked beside him, her Auspex unit held loosely at her side, running passive sweeps as Voss had instructed. She was trying to be subtle about it. She was not entirely succeeding. The deacon, Cassell, had noticed the device but said nothing, which told Voss something. Either the man was well trained in the political reality of inquisitorial visits and understood that cooperation meant not asking questions, or he had nothing to hide and therefore felt no instinct to react. Both possibilities were worth tracking. "The High Confessor is eager to receive you," Cassell said, guiding them through the cathedral's outer precinct. "He has prepared a formal welcome in the Hall of the Undying and asks if you would join him for the midday observance. The choir is..." He paused, searching for adequate words. "Something you should experience before you form any impressions of us." "I never form impressions before I've gathered data," Voss said pleasantly. Cassell smiled as though this were a joke. Voss let him. The cathedral's interior was vast and layered with the accumulated devotional weight of 80 years of genuine faith. That was the only way Voss could describe it. Genuine. He had stood in cathedrals across the sector, grand ones, ancient ones, cathedrals built to intimidate and cathedrals built to awe. This one was built, improbably, to welcome. The nave's proportions were immense but not crushing. The stained acrylate windows admitted light in warm amber bands that fell across the stone floor in patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their comfort. The air smelled of candle smoke and dried flowers and something else, something underneath, that Voss catalogued without identifying yet. A faint mineral sweetness, like rain on warm stone. His secondary acolyte, a scarred veteran named Torvin who had served Voss for 11 years and communicated primarily in grunts and eyebrow movements, drifted close and murmured 2 words. Warp trace. Faint. Voss gave no visible reaction. How faint? Below threshold. Wouldn't flag on a standard sweep. But it's there. It's there. This was the instrument Voss had brought for exactly this purpose. A modified Auspex unit, reconfigured by a savant-level Mechanicus adept to detect psychic resonance at concentrations far below what standard inquisitorial equipment registered. The Mechanicus adept had called it, or with characteristic understatement, an enhanced sensitivity array. Voss called it the Truth Finder. It had saved his life twice and cost him 3 allies who had turned out to be something other than they appeared. A faint warp trace in a cathedral was not automatically damning. Psychers prayed. Saints left residue. The Emperor's own light, according to some Scholastica Psychana theorists, manifested as a form of warp resonance in places of deep and genuine faith. It was, technically, impossible that what Torvin was reading was simply the accumulated psychic weight of 80 years of sincere devotion. Technically possible. Voss watched a mother guide her small son through the sign of the Aquila before a side chapel shrine. The boy's face was unafraid, peaceful. The mother's lips moved in what looked like genuine prayer, not rote recitation. He thought about the reports, the perfect statistics, the content population, the miracles. He thought about what kind of entity, or in the vast and hungry darkness of the warp, would grant miracles freely and ask nothing visible in return. The choir began. 200 voices, perfectly harmonized, rising into the vaulted space above him like smoke. It was, objectively, one of the most beautiful sounds Aldrich Voss had ever heard. His hand found the Truth Finder's readings again. The resonance spiked briefly with the first note, then settled back to its faint, patient hum. Still with us in the darkness? Hit that like button if this tale is already chilling your soul. The midday observance lasted 40 minutes and felt like 10. That was the first thing Voss recorded in his personal cipher journal that evening, sitting alone in the guest quarters the cathedral had provided. Comfortable quarters, warm, with a window overlooking the Pilgrim Gardens. He had swept the room for listening devices before unpacking. Found none. That was either genuine hospitality or extraordinary confidence, and he was not yet certain which. The observance lasted 40 minutes. It felt like 10. Note: subjective time distortion during worship, possible psychic influence on congregation's perception, possible mundane explanation, exceptional liturgical craft, skilled choir, architectural acoustics designed to induce meditative state. Do not conclude prematurely. Observe. He had been an inquisitor for 38 years. He had learned at considerable cost that the most dangerous mistake an investigator could make was to find what he was looking for before he had finished looking. Confirmation ran in both directions. It could blind you to guilt. It could equally blind you to innocence. But the choir. He closed the journal and stared at the ceiling. The choir had sung the standard Ministorum liturgy, the canticle of the Emperor's endurance, the hymn of the martyred saint, the recessional of souls departed. Nothing heretical in the text. Nothing that would flag in any theological review. The words were orthodox to the syllable. And yet, listening to them, Voss had experienced something he had not felt in a very long time, something he had trained himself to treat with extreme suspicion, precisely because it was so effective at disabling critical thought. He had felt comforted, not overwhelmed, not coerced, not the hammer-blow psychic compulsion he had encountered in genuine chaos-touched spaces, where the warp pressed against reality like a fist through wet cloth, and ordinary human cognition buckled under the pressure. This was nothing like that. This was the feeling of setting down a weight you had been carrying so long you had forgotten it was there, a loosening, a warmth, the specific treacherous relief of believing for just a moment that everything might be all right. Voss had felt it, identified it, and locked it behind 17 years of mental conditioning in approximately 4 seconds. His inquisitorial training included extensive work with Scholastica Psychana adepts on recognizing and resisting low-grade psychic influence, the kind that didn't announce itself, the kind that simply made you feel slightly better about everything and gradually, incrementally, eroded your capacity for doubt. The kind that was almost impossible to prove. Priya had not been as well armored. He had watched her from the corner of his eye throughout the service. She was a capable young woman, perceptive, disciplined, not given to sentimentality. By the third canticle, she had tears on her face and was not aware of it. When Voss had touched her arm at the recessional, she had startled as though surfacing from deep water, blinking, briefly disoriented. She had apologized. He had told her not to. The following morning, he sent her and Torvan to conduct separate interviews, Priya to the cathedral's administrative records, Torvan to the city's civil infrastructure, and went himself to meet the High Confessor. Confessor Aldous Marn was 81 years old and looked, Voss thought, like a man who had made peace with every difficult thing in his long life. He was slight, white-haired, with the careful movements of someone managing old pain with old discipline. He had served the cathedral for 53 years, having arrived as a junior deacon 2 decades after Sarah Valtis's death, and had risen through the Ministorum hierarchy not through political acumen. He had none, by all accounts, and seemed to regard it as a minor character defect he had simply chosen not to address. But through the specific quality of his faith, people believed him, not because he was eloquent, though he was, not because he was learned, though he was that too, but because when Aldous Marn spoke about the Emperor, he spoke the way a man speaks about someone he has actually met. "You're here to investigate us," Marn said as soon as they were seated. Not an accusation, a statement of fact offered with the same calm he might use to note that the morning was cool. "I'm here to observe," Voss said. "Of course." Marnie folded his hands on the table between them. "The Inquisition observes, and then it concludes, and then it acts. I've been expecting someone like you for approximately 15 years, Inquisitor. I'm only surprised it took this long." Voss studied the old man. "Why 15 years?" "Because that's when the healings began in earnest. Before that, we had what you might call quiet grace, prosperity, well-being, difficult to quantify, easy to attribute to good governance and fortunate circumstance." Marn's eyes, pale blue and very steady, held Voss's without discomfort. But 15 years ago, so a child with Krieger's wasting, a degenerative neural condition, fatal within 2 years of onset, no known medical treatment at our tech level, was brought to the altar by her mother. She was healed within a week, completely, verifiably. "I have the medical documentation." "I've read it," Voss said. "Then you know it cannot be explained." "Many things cannot be explained that are nonetheless not miraculous." Marn smiled, not unkindly. "You sound like a man who has been disappointed by miracles before." Voss said nothing. Outside the confessor's window, the pilgrim gardens were filling with the mourning faithful. An old man moved slowly between the flower beds, stopping to touch each bloom with something that looked indistinguishable from gratitude. "Tell me," Voss said, "what do your people believe they are praying to?" Marna looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his pale eyes, not evasion, not fear, something older and more complicated. "The Emperor," he said, "as they always have." It was a true answer. Voss was certain of it. It was also, he was beginning to suspect, not the complete one. Priya found the first anomaly in the cathedral's records on the afternoon of the second day, and brought it to Voss with the careful, measured delivery of someone who had learned that presenting conclusions before evidence was a reliable way to be sent back to find more evidence. She spread 3 data slates across the table in their shared operational space, a back room in the guest quarters that Voss had converted into a field analysis center, its walls now covered in cipher notation and cross-referenced timelines. Torvin sat in the corner, sharpening a blade he never seemed to actually use, which was his way of indicating he was paying close attention. "Cathedral records go back 81 years, Priya began. Full administrative continuity, tithe records, congregation counts, Ministorum correspondence, architectural logs. Whoever has been running this place administratively is meticulous, almost obsessively so." She paused. "Which is why the gap is interesting." "Show me," Voss said. She tapped the first slate. Year 43 of the cathedral's operation, approximately 40 years ago. There's a 17-day period where the records simply stop. Not damaged, not redacted. The entries before and after are pristine. But for 17 days, nothing was recorded. No tithes logged, no correspondence filed, no congregation counts. So as though the entire administrative apparatus of a cathedral serving 200,000 worshippers simply forgot to exist. Cross-reference with civil records for the same period, Voss said. "Done." She tapped the second slate. The city's civil records show the same gap, 17 days, same dates exactly. And here, she moved to the third slate. I pulled the astropathic logs from the sector relay station. Viridia's Hope went vox silent for 17 days in that same period. No outgoing transmissions, no incoming acknowledgements. The relay station logged it as a possible technical fault and flagged it for follow-up. She looked up. The follow-up was never conducted. Torvin grunted from his corner. It was the grunt that meant that's not a coincidence. Voss agreed, but kept his expression neutral. What happened immediately after the gap ended? Priya hesitated. The healings began, not the major ones. Those came later. But the first documented cases of what the cathedral records call graced recoveries appear within 3 months of the gap. Before the gap, nothing. After, a steady escalation over 40 years to what we have now. Voss stood and moved to the wall where he had pinned his timeline. 40 years of escalating miracles, a 17-day gap at the beginning of it all. And somewhere beneath the cathedral, the faint, persistent hum of warp resonance that his truth finder tracked like a slow heartbeat. Something had happened 40 years ago, something that left no record because, for 17 days, no one on Viridia's Hope had been capable of keeping one, or had been prevented from doing so, or had simply not noticed the time passing, which was in some ways the most disturbing possibility of all. He needed to go deeper into the cathedral's history, and to do that, he needed access that Confessor Marn had not yet offered. He found the High Confessor in the cathedral's private library that evening, a high vaulted room of ancient shelving and older books, smelling of binding glue and the specific dusty sanctity of texts handled by devoted hands across many decades. Marn was reading by lamplight, unhurried, and looked up without surprise when Voss entered. "I expected you sooner," the old man said. I wanted to be certain of my questions before I asked them. Voss took the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. 40 years ago, 17 days. What happened? Marn closed his book with the careful deliberation of someone buying time to choose their words precisely. In the lamplight, he looked very old and very tired, and very much like a man carrying a weight that had become so familiar he could no longer remember what standing fully upright felt like. I wasn't here, he said finally. I arrived 20 years ago. Whatever happened in that period is outside my direct knowledge, but not outside your awareness. A long silence. The lamp flickered. Somewhere in the cathedral above them, the evening bells began their 6th hour toll, deep and resonant, rolling through the stone like something alive. There was a woman, Marn said when the bells faded. Before my time. A pilgrim who came to the cathedral in the early years of the healings. She was not from Viridia's Hope. No one could determine where she was from precisely. She stayed for several months, living in the pilgrim quarters, attending every observance. She spoke to the congregation rarely, but when she did, people remembered what she said for years afterward. He paused. She called herself a servant of the undying light. The congregation assumed she meant the emperor. They had no reason not to. And when she left, the healings intensified, as though her presence had seeded something, established something. Marn looked down at his folded hands. I have read the accounts of those who knew her. Every one of them describes the same experience in her presence, the same feeling of warmth, of being known, of being held. Voss felt the hairs on his arms rise beneath his coat. He kept his voice even. What was her name? Marna looked up. His pale eyes were steady. But something behind them had shifted. A door opening onto a room that had been sealed for a long time. She gave no name, but the congregation had one for her. He hesitated. They called her the Mother of Quiet Mercies. The name meant nothing to Voss immediately. He filed it, turned it, examined its edges. Then something in the deep archive of his 38 years of inquisitorial scholarship surfaced slowly, like wreckage rising from dark water. His hand moved to his cipher journal before he was consciously aware of reaching for it. Quiet Mercies, the comforter, the one who holds, the healer of unasked wounds, epithets, all of them epithets for the same entity. An entity classified in the most restricted tiers of Ordo Hereticus documentation, the files that required 3 separate Rosette-level authorizations to access that were stored in physical vaults on the fortress monastery of the Ordo's inner conclave, odd that most serving inquisitors never encountered in their entire careers, because the entity they described was considered, by the senior-most minds of the Ordo Hereticus, to be something that perhaps should not be widely known about. Not because it was overwhelmingly dangerous in the way of the great chaos powers, but because it was overwhelmingly appealing. The comment section is open. What do you think hides beneath that altar? Drop your theories below. The entity had no true name in the restricted files. That was the first thing Voss had noted when he had encountered the documentation. Briefly, years ago, in the aftermath of a purge on Scintilla that had touched the edges of something the senior inquisitor leading the operation had refused to discuss openly. The files existed in fragments, deliberately scattered across multiple archive nodes, so that no single reader could assemble a complete picture without authorization that almost no one possessed. Voss possessed it. He had for 11 years, granted by a dying mentor who had pressed a data chip into his hand and said only, "If you ever encounter the quiet, you will need to know what you are looking at before you decide what to do about it." He had read the files once, committed them to memory with the mnemonic disciplines the Inquisition trained into its operatives from the earliest years. Then he had not thought about them again, because in 11 years he had never encountered anything that matched the profile, until now. The entity, designated in the files as Phenomenon Theta Serene, a deliberately bureaucratic label chosen to avoid the psychological weight that a true name would carry, was not a chaos power. That was the critical distinction, and the source of the profound difficulty it represented. The four great powers of chaos fed on specific human emotional frequencies: rage, despair, excess, ambition. They were, in the theological framework of the Ordo Hereticus, parasites, drawing strength from the darkest distillations of human experience, warping their hosts, consuming them, leaving ruin. Theta Serene fed on something else entirely. It fed on gratitude, specifically on the psychic resonance generated by genuine, sustained, freely given thankfulness. The kind produced not by coerced worship or fearful observance, but by communities of people who genuinely believed that something had helped them and were genuinely, deeply, continuously glad of it. It did not corrupt its hosts. It did not whisper commands or demand sacrifice or twist minds toward violence. It simply accepted the offering, absorbed the gratitude, and in return, because the mechanism was apparently self-sustaining and required ongoing positive resonance to function, it gave back. It healed the sick. It quieted the afraid. It made harvests slightly more abundant and children slightly more robust, and the weight of ordinary suffering very slightly more bearable. It was, by any measure Voss could construct, the least harmful warp entity in any documented file he had ever read, which was precisely why it was classified at the highest possible level of restriction. Because the question it posed, the question that the senior minds of the Ordo Hereticus had apparently been wrestling with for at least 2 centuries, in sealed chambers and restricted correspondence that Voss had read with growing unease, was not how do we destroy it. The question was, should we? He sat with this for 3 days. He conducted his investigation with the same methodical precision he brought to every assignment, because methodical precision was the only thing standing between good inquisitorial work and the kind of catastrophic errors that ended worlds. Priya and Torvan continued their surveys. The Truth Finder continued its passive monitoring. The cathedral continued its observances, its bells, its warm amber light, and its choir that made Priya cry without knowing it, and made Torvan twice go very still in ways that Voss had never seen from the scarred veteran in 11 years of shared service. On the 4th day, Voss descended beneath the altar. He had found the access point through a combination of the architectural logs Priya had surfaced and his own careful physical survey of the cathedral's foundation levels, old maintenance corridors, predating the current structure, cut into bedrock by whatever had stood on this site before Sarah Valdis rebuilt it. The passage was not hidden exactly. It was simply unlit and unmentioned and located behind a storage rack of devotional candles in a sub-basement that no one had reason to visit. He went alone. He had not told Priya or Torvin what he expected to find. The passage descended for 40 meters and opened into a chamber that had not been made by human hands. Not in any physically inexplicable sense. The stone was stone. The carving was carving. The dimensions were those of a room that human beings could have constructed. But the geometry of it was wrong in the specific way that spaces touched by warp influence were sometimes wrong, as though the room existed at a very slight angle to the reality surrounding it. The air was warm and dry and carried that mineral sweetness he had first noticed in the cathedral above. Stronger here, pervasive, like standing inside the smell itself. At the center of the chamber was a formation that might have been a natural rock outcropping and might have been something else. It was roughly columnar, rising to perhaps 2 meters, its surface smooth in a way that stone smoothed by water over millennia was smooth. It pulsed very faintly, with a light that had no apparent source, not bioluminescence, not reflected light, not any form of illumination that Voss could identify. Simply light, residing in the stone, slow and patient and deeply, says unutterably calm. The truth finder in his coat pocket went silent, not inactive, not switched off. Silent, registering a reading so far outside its normal parameters that it had defaulted to 0 rather than attempt to quantify what it was measuring. Voss stood in the chamber for a long time. He thought about the child with Krieger's wasting, healed completely in a week. He thought about Priya's tears and Torven's stillness, and the old man in the pilgrim gardens touching each flower with gratitude. He thought about 4 million people on a world that should have been unremarkable, living lives that were, by the brutal arithmetic of the 41st millennium, genuinely and measurably better than they had any statistical right to be. He thought about the Ordo Hereticus, about the sealed files, about the question that the senior minds had been wrestling with for 2 centuries. He thought about the Emperor, the God Emperor of mankind who had refused in life to be worshipped, who had built the Imperial Truth on the foundation of reason, not faith, who had watched the religion that bore his name grow in his silence and done nothing to stop it, for reasons that the greatest theological minds of 10,000 years had never resolved to anyone's satisfaction. He thought about what it meant that the Emperor had known. The files were clear on this. Theta Serene had been documented for 2 centuries. Its presence on Viridia's Hope specifically flagged in a restricted sub-report for at least 60 years. The information existed. The Inquisition knew, and no order of purification had been issued. No exterminatus, no Grey Knights, no black ships, nothing. For 60 years, the Emperor's servants had known what was being worshipped on Viridia's Hope. So, and the Emperor had said nothing, and the Inquisition had filed reports and argued in sealed chambers, and ultimately, for 60 years, done nothing at all. Voss looked at the light in the stone, patient, warm, waiting. Why, he thought, would you let them keep praying to the wrong god? The light did not answer. It simply was, present, calm, entirely without malice, entirely without the specific hunger that every other warp entity Voss had ever encountered carried in its presence like a smell. He stayed in the chamber until the 6th hour bells rang above him, felt distantly through 40 meters of stone. Then he climbed back up through the passage, replaced the storage rack of devotional candles, and went to find Confessor Marn. Marn was where Voss had come to expect him in the evening hours. The private library, lamplight, an open book that may or may not have been the thing actually occupying his attention. The old confessor looked up when Voss entered and read something in the Inquisitor's face that made him set the book aside with a care that suggested finality. "You found it," Marna said. Not a question. Voss sat down and for a long moment said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. "How long have you known?" Voss asked finally. "About the chamber?" Marn folded his hands in the gesture Voss had come to recognize as his method of organizing difficult thoughts. 12 years. I found the passage during a structural survey. The foundation levels needed assessment after a minor seismic event, and I insisted on conducting the survey personally. A pause. I am not entirely certain why I insisted. In retrospect, I think I was meant to find it. Meant by what? Marn met his eyes steadily. That is the question I have spent 12 years being unable to answer with the certainty my office requires. Voss leaned forward. Walk me through what you felt when you first entered the chamber. The old man was quiet for a moment. Outside, the pilgrim gardens had darkened with the evening, and the cathedral's exterior lumens had come on, casting pale light through the library window across the shelves of ancient texts. Peace, Marnie said finally. Not the peace of ignorance or the peace of defeat. The peace of completion. As though every question I had carried through 50 years of ministry had not been answered, precisely, but had become somehow less urgent. As though the questions themselves were smaller than I had believed, and what surrounded them was larger. He paused. I am aware of how that sounds to an inquisitor. It sounds like psychic influence, Voss said. Yes, I know. Marna did not look away. I have asked myself every day for 12 years whether what I felt in that chamber was genuine or manufactured, whether my subsequent decisions have been my own or guided. I have no certain answer. I have only the observation that in 12 years of asking the question, I have found no evidence that anything has been asked of me that I would not have chosen freely. Nothing has been asked of you, Voss said carefully, that you are aware of. Correct. Marn acknowledged this with the gravity it deserved. I cannot rule out influence I cannot perceive. No one can. That is the fundamental problem, isn't it? The thing in that chamber, whatever it is, operates below the threshold of coercion. It does not command. It does not corrupt. It simply persists. And in persisting, it makes things better. And that very fact is what makes it impossible to evaluate cleanly. Voss stood and moved to the window. The evening pilgrims were still moving through the gardens below. Fewer now, the last of the day's faithful, moving slowly in the pale lumen light, with the unhurried quality of people who were not afraid of the dark. He thought about the Ordo Hereticus's sealed deliberations. He had read them carefully enough to reconstruct the broad shape of the argument, even where specific pages had been excised. The fundamental division, as best he could determine, ran along a line that was less theological than practical. On one side, the purists, those who held that the source of a gift determined its nature absolutely, that a miracle drawn from the warp was a corruption regardless of its visible effects, that the congregation of Viridia's hope were being subtly altered, their psychic resonance harvested, their faith redirected from the Emperor to an entity that wore no face and made no demands precisely because it had learned, over whatever span of existence it possessed, that demand was the fastest way to end a reliable source of sustenance, that the comfort was real but the cost was hidden, and the reckoning would come. On the other side, a smaller group, whose contributions to the sealed files were shorter and more tentative, as though the writers were aware they were saying something that their institution was not equipped to hear. These argued that the effects were the measure, that 4 million people living better, healthier, less terrified lives was a moral reality that could not simply be annulled by the impurity of its origin, that the Emperor himself, who had, in documented history, made use of tools and alliances that strict orthodoxy would have condemned, might look at Viridia's hope and see not an abomination, but a question worth sitting with, that the 60 years of inquisitorial inaction was not bureaucratic failure, that it was, possibly, an answer. Voss had been in the Inquisition long enough to know that institutional inaction was rarely a deliberate policy, and usually an accumulation of individual hesitations. But he had also been in the Inquisition long enough to know that some hesitations were wiser than the actions they prevented. The congregation, he said, still looking out the window. The people who come here every day, worship every 6th hour, bring their sick children and their grieving parents and their exhausted, war-worn souls. What do you believe they deserve to know? Marn was silent for a long moment. I have asked myself that question for 12 years as well, he said. I have never found an answer that does not break something. Tell me the answers anyway. The old confessor took a slow breath. If I tell them the truth, that the entity receiving their prayers is not the Emperor, I destroy their faith, not merely in the thing they have been praying to, in faith itself. in the possibility that prayer means anything, that comfort is real, that the warmth they have felt for their entire lives was not a lie precisely, but was misdirected. His voice was steady, but the weight behind it was enormous. Some of them will survive that. Many will not. I have watched what happens to people when the thing that holds them together is removed. I have performed the funerals. And if you don't tell them, then I am complicit in a deception that may have no malicious intent, but has no consent either. Mon looked up. They are good people. Inquisitor, they are faithful people. They believe with everything they are that the Emperor hears them, that their prayers reach him, that the warmth they feel is his presence. His pale eyes were very steady. The cruelty of their situation is not that they have been given something harmful. It is that they have been given something real, comfort, healing, genuine grace, by something that is not what they think it is. And I do not know whether that makes it a gift or a theft. Voss turned from the window. There is a third possibility, he said. One that the sealed files gesture toward without ever stating directly. Mon waited. What if the Emperor knew from the beginning, Voss said, and permitted it? Not through inaction or oversight, deliberately. Because he understood something about the nature of faith and the nature of this entity that the Ordo Hereticus has spent 2 centuries refusing to consider. The library was very quiet. The lamp between them burned without flickering. That would mean, Mon said slowly, that the Emperor chose to let his people pray to something else, and found that acceptable. Or found it useful, Voss said, or found it merciful, in a way that the institutions built in his name are not equipped to be. The old confessor looked at the Inquisitor for a long time. That is either the most profound theological insight I have heard in 50 years of ministry, he said at last, or it is exactly the kind of rationalization that the thing in that chamber would want us to arrive at. Voss said nothing, because Mon was right, and that was the problem. That had always been the problem. In the presence of Theta Serene, the arguments for mercy became more persuasive. The arguments for destruction became harder to hold, and there was absolutely no way to determine whether that was because the merciful arguments were correct, or because something patient and hungry and very, very old had learned over centuries exactly how to make them feel that way. The tension builds. Subscribe now to witness how this reckoning ends. On the morning of the 6th day, Voss made a decision that he had been trained for 38 years never to make. He told Priya and Torvin everything. Not because the regulations permitted it. They did not, strictly speaking. The Theta Serene files were his alone to carry, his alone to act upon. Sharing restricted intelligence with junior operatives without senior inquisitorial authorization was a procedural violation that, under different circumstances, I could result in censure before the conclave, but Voss had lived long enough to understand that the rules of his institution were built for the average case, and that the average case was not what he was standing in. He laid it out without embellishment. The entity, the files, the 60 years of deliberate inaction, the chamber beneath the altar, the question that the Ordo's greatest minds had spent 2 centuries failing to answer. He watched Priya and Torvan absorb it with the specific, all-controlled stillness of people receiving information that is reorganizing everything they thought they understood about a situation. When he finished, Priya spoke first. "The healings are real," she said. It was not a question. "Medically verified across 80 years of documented cases," Voss confirmed. "The child with Krieger's wasting, 47 subsequent cases of conditions with no standard Medicaid treatment at this tech level. All resolved, all permanent. See no relapse recorded in any case. And the entity receives gratitude, that's all. It doesn't take anything else." Nothing documented, nothing detected, Voss paused. Which does not mean nothing is taken. It means nothing visible is taken. The distinction matters. Torvin, who had been sitting with his arms folded and his scarred face completely unreadable through all of this, spoke for only the second time in 6 days. What does it want? As far as the files can determine. To continue, or to persist, to maintain the conditions that sustain it. Voss looked at the veteran carefully. It wants the congregation to remain faithful, content, and grateful, which means it wants them healthy, prosperous, and unafraid. Its interests and their interests are functionally aligned. Until they aren't, Torvin said. Until they aren't, Voss agreed. That was the core of it. The purists in the sealed files had argued it repeatedly, in different formulations, and none of their arguments had been successfully refuted, only weighed against the alternative and found, by whoever had most recently reviewed the files, to be insufficiently conclusive to justify action. An entity whose interests aligned with the well-being of its host population was not inherently stable. Alignment was not identity. What sustained the entity now might not sustain it in different circumstances. A drought, a war, a crisis that made gratitude harder to generate and fear easier. Under sufficient pressure, what did Theta Serene become? The files had no answer. There were no documented cases of a Theta Serene situation reaching that kind of pressure point, because every previous documented encounter had been purged before the question could be tested. Voss had spent 3 nights thinking about that fact. About what it meant that the Ordo had, every other time, resolved the question by eliminating it before it became answerable. Whether that was wisdom or whether it was the institutional equivalent of refusing to read the last page of a book because the ending might be uncomfortable. He gathered his team in the operational space and spread the full timeline across the table. Everything Priya and Torvin had gathered. Everything from the cathedral records, his own observations, the Truthfinder's readings mapped across 6 days of passive monitoring. The resonance is stable, Priya said, tracing the Truthfinder's output with one finger. No escalation over the monitoring period, no variation correlated with congregation size or observance intensity. It's just there, constant. Like a heartbeat, Torvin said. Yes. Priya looked up. A very slow, very steady heartbeat. Whatever it is, it's been doing this for a long time, and it's not accelerating. Voss nodded. This matched what the files described. Theta Serene situations, once established, were characterized by profound stability. The entity was not ambitious in any detectable sense. It was not expanding, not seeking new host populations, not transmitting itself or replicating its conditions elsewhere. It had found Viridia's hope, established a relationship with its population, and appeared entirely content to maintain that relationship indefinitely. Content. The word kept appearing in his thinking, and he kept examining it for the manipulation he suspected was embedded in it. So on the afternoon of the 6th day, Sister Marin came to find him. He had noted the cathedral's lay servant on arrival and flagged her for follow-up. Her quiet watchfulness had marked her as someone who understood more than her position required. He had been waiting for her to make a move, and had begun to wonder by the 5th day whether he had misread her entirely. He had not misread her. She found him in the Pilgrim Gardens, where he had taken to walking in the evenings because the gardens were public and unwatched, and the open air gave him space to think. She fell into step beside him without preamble, which told him immediately that she was not here to perform the role of deferential lay servant. "You've been below the altar," she said. "Yes." "And you've spoken with the confessor?" "Yes." She was silent for several paces. She was perhaps 50, say with a face that had been weathered by outdoor work and something harder than weather, and eyes that had the particular quality of people who have looked at difficult things for a long time and decided to keep looking anyway. "I grew up here," she said finally. "Third generation. My grandmother came as a pilgrim and never left. My mother was born in the pilgrim quarters and raised in the cathedral's shadow. I was born in Varus Prime, and I have never left this world." She paused. "My daughter had Krieger's wasting." Voss stopped walking. Maren stopped beside him, looking out over the gardens with the stillness of someone who had made peace with the weight of what they were carrying. "She was 4 years old," Maren said. "The Medicae gave her 18 months. I brought her to the altar because I had nothing else, because the prayers I had been saying my entire life had run out, and I needed somewhere to put the last ones." Her voice was level, controlled. The voice of someone who had told this story to herself many times in private and had learned to carry it without breaking. She recovered in 6 days. She is 23 years old now. She lives in the northern settlements. She has 2 children of her own. The pilgrim gardens were very quiet around them. Somewhere in the cathedral above, the choir was practicing, faint through the stone walls, the sound arriving as texture rather than melody. "I found the chamber 11 years ago," Maren continued, "before the confessor. I found it because my daughter's recovery sent me looking for the truth of this place with the same intensity that desperation had sent me to the altar." She finally looked at him. "I have known for 11 years what receives our prayers. I have spent 11 years deciding what to do with that knowledge." "And," Voss said. "And I decided," Maren said quietly, "that the question of what it is matters less than the question of what it does. My daughter is alive. 20,000 pilgrims have been healed in 80 years of documented record. 4 million people live better lives than the mathematics of this galaxy entitles them to." Her eyes were steady and without apology. "I am not a theologian. I cannot tell you whether what is in that chamber is sacred or profane, or something the Imperium has no category for. Oh, but I can tell you that my daughter breathes, and I will not pretend that counts for nothing." Voss looked at her for a long moment. "You came to tell me this," he said, "knowing what I am, knowing what I could do." "Yes." "Why?" Maren held his gaze without flinching. "Because you have been walking these gardens for 3 evenings, and you have not called your ship. You have not filed a preliminary action report. You have been sitting with the question the same way the confessor has been sitting with it for 12 years, and the way I have been sitting with it for 11. She paused. "I came to tell you that you are not alone in sitting with it, and that the people who worship in that cathedral above us deserve to have someone sit with it carefully." Voss said nothing for a long time. The choir's practice resolved into something clear and whole, arising briefly above the stone before the rehearsal broke and the voices scattered into silence. "Your daughter," he said at last. "Does she know?" Maren looked back toward the cathedral. "No," she said. "She prays to the Emperor. She is grateful to the Emperor. She believes with her whole heart that the Emperor heard her mother's prayers and answered them." A pause. "I have never decided whether taking that from her would be mercy or cruelty." Voss began walking again, slowly, and Maren fell into step beside him. He had 6 more sections of this story to navigate, and not a single one of them was going to be simple. The Vox came on the morning of the 7th day. Not from Viridia's Hope, from outside, a tight beam transmission on a frequency that only 3 people in the Calixis sector knew to use when contacting Aldrich Voss. It arrived encrypted in a cipher that took his decoding unit 4 minutes to unpack, which meant it had been sent from someone with access to inquisitorial-grade encryption hardware and the specific key sequence that Voss had last updated 14 months ago on a station orbiting Scintilla. He read it twice. Then he sat very still for a long time. The message was from Senior Inquisitor Havelock Crane. Voss had known Crane for 20 years, not as a friend, precisely, because the Inquisition did not readily produce friendships, but as something more durable than an acquaintance and more honest than an ally. Crane was 78 years old, a purist in his theology and a pragmatist in his methods, and one of perhaps 6 people in the sector whose judgment Voss trusted without reservation. The message was 11 words long. The conclave has been informed. A decision is expected within 30 days. Be advised. Voss folded the decoded slip and burned it over the lamp in his operational space. He watched it char and curl and reduce to ash, and thought about what 30 days meant in practical terms. It meant the deliberation that had been ongoing in sealed chambers for 2 centuries had been forced to a conclusion. Someone, he did not know who, did not know how, had escalated Viridia's hope from a flagged anomaly in a restricted file to an active agenda item before the inner conclave of the Ordo Hereticus. The institution that had spent 60 years carefully not deciding was now being required to decide. And Crane's message, stripped of everything except its 11 words, contained a warning that Voss read with perfect clarity. Whatever you are going to do, you have 30 days to do it before the conclave's decision arrives and removes the option from your hands. He called Priya and Torvan. We have a timetable, he said, and told them about the message without specifying its source. 30 days before external action becomes likely. Possibly less. Priya absorbed this with the focused calm she defaulted to under pressure. What kind of action? The full range is possible. Purification of the site. Exterminatus is unlikely given the planet's tithe value, but cannot be ruled out. More probably, a specialized team. Grey Knights, possibly, or a senior inquisitor with a purge mandate, and the kind of certainty I have spent 7 days failing to feel. He paused. The congregation would not survive contact with a purge operation psychologically intact. The cultural infrastructure of this world is built entirely around the cathedral and its faith. Remove that, even surgically, and you are looking at societal collapse on a scale that will reduce tithe output to 0 for a generation, and probably trigger the civil instability that precedes worse things. Torvan said nothing. He had the expression of a man doing mathematics he did not enjoy. So we have 30 days to resolve a question that the Ordo's best minds haven't resolved in 2 centuries, Priya said. We have 30 days to do something, Voss corrected. What that something is, I don't yet know. He spent the morning in the operational space, working through the problem with the systematic rigor that had carried him through 38 years of impossible situations. He built a decision matrix on the wall beside his timeline, not because he expected the matrix to produce an answer, but because the act of constructing it forced him to be honest about what he actually knew versus what he was assuming. Column 1. Purge the site. Destroy the chamber. Eliminate the entity's anchor point. Effects. Immediate cessation of warp resonance. Confirmed removal of non-sanctioned influence. Costs. Collapse of the congregation's faith. Probable psychological devastation for 4 million people. Loss of 80 years of genuine communal well-being, and no certainty that the entity itself would be destroyed rather than simply displaced. Column 2. Maintain status quo. File an inconclusive report. Return to his ship and leave Viridia's hope exactly as he found it. Effects. 4 million people continue their lives undisturbed. Costs. Deliberate inaction in the face of a confirmed, non-sanctioned warp presence. A violation of his mandate, and the absolute certainty that in 30 days the conclave's decision would arrive, and the choice would be made by someone with less information and considerably more certainty than Aldrich Voss. Column 3 was harder to write. He stared at the blank space beneath it for a long time before he began. Column 3. Tell them. Not the conclave, not his superiors. The congregation. The 4 million people of Viridia's hope who had been praying faithfully and devoutly to something that received their prayers but wore a face that was not the one they believed. He thought about Marin's daughter breathing. He thought about Confessor Mon sitting with his impossible weight for 12 years. He thought about the child healed in 6 days and the 20,000 documented recoveries, and the old man in the gardens touching each flower with gratitude. He thought about what it meant to tell someone that the love they had been given was real, but the name they had been given for it was wrong. In the afternoon, he went back to the cathedral, not to the chamber beneath it. He had been below the altar 3 times now, and each time had come back with the same absence of conclusion. He went to the nave, to the vast amber-lit space where the congregation gathered, and he sat in the rear pews and watched the midday observance. It was, as it had been every time he witnessed it, an act of genuine devotion. No performance, no coercion, no hollow recitation. These were people who believed, completely, without reservation, with the specific wholeness of faith that Voss had seen in perhaps a dozen places in 38 years of travel across the darkest corners of the Imperium. Faith that had not been manufactured by fear or sustained by ignorance, but had grown organically, from 80 years of a community that had found something that seemed to hear them. He watched an elderly man in the 3rd pew pray with his eyes closed and his lips moving and his hands folded in the aquila, and he thought about the Emperor, the God Emperor of mankind, 10,000 years on the golden throne, sustaining the Astronomicon, holding back the tide of the warp through an act of psychic will so vast and so sustained that the greatest minds of the Imperium could not fully comprehend its nature. An entity, because that was what the Emperor was, whatever else, of such immense psychic presence that his influence permeated the warp itself, guided navigators across impossible distances, manifested in the faith of billions as something that genuinely responded. The Emperor who had, for 60 years, it looked at Viridia's hope through the countless eyes of his servants and said nothing. Voss sat in the pew and did something he had not done in a very long time. He prayed, not to Theta Serene, not to the warm light in the stone below him, patient and without malice. He directed his prayer upward and outward toward the distant burning beacon of the Astronomicon, toward the enthroned figure at the heart of a dying empire who had, against all probability and reason, chosen to spend 10,000 years sustaining the species that had put him on that throne. He prayed for guidance, for clarity, for some indication, however small, of what the Emperor actually wanted him to do. The choir began the afternoon canticle, 200 voices rising into amber light. The truth finder in his pocket hummed its faint, patient hum. And Aldrich Voss, 38-year veteran of the Ordo Hereticus, sat in the pew and felt, with sudden and absolute certainty, that the Emperor was not going to answer him. Not because the Emperor could not because the prayer had gone unheard, but because the Emperor had already answered. 60 years ago, with silence, with inaction, with the deliberate, considered choice of an entity that had spent 10,000 years making decisions that no institution built in his name was large enough to contain. The Emperor had looked at Viridia's hope and had chosen not to destroy it. That was the answer. It had always been the answer. The question, the only question that remained, was whether Aldrich Voss had the courage to act on it. He summoned Confessor Mon and Sister Marin together on the evening of the 7th day, which was also the evening on which he made the decision that he understood, with complete clarity, would define the remainder of his career and possibly end it. He did not tell them about the Conclave's 30-day window. That information belonged to the Inquisition, and he would not compromise operational security even now, even here, even in a situation that had dissolved most of his other certainties. But he told them what he had concluded in the pew that afternoon, and he told them what he intended to do, and he watched their faces as they understood the magnitude of what he was proposing. Marn sat very still for a long time after Voss finished speaking. "You want to tell them," the old confessor said, "the congregation, all of them. Not all at once, not without preparation. But yes." Voss held the old man's gaze. "I have spent 7 days looking for an alternative, and I cannot find one that I can defend. The purge option destroys what has taken 80 years to build and accomplishes nothing that I can demonstrate is necessary. The inaction option hands the decision to the conclave in 30 days, and the conclave will purge. Not out of malice, but out of institutional reflex, because that is what institutions do when they are finally forced to act on questions they have avoided for too long." He paused. "The only option that treats the people of this world as something other than a problem to be managed is the one that gives them the truth and trusts them to survive it." "You believe they can survive it," Marn said. It was not quite a question. "I believe some of them can. I believe the ones who cannot will need significant pastoral support." He looked at Marn. "Which is why I need you." The old confessor absorbed this with the careful deliberation of a man who had spent 50 years in ministry and understood that there were burdens that, once accepted, could not be set down again. "What exactly would you have me tell them?" Marn asked. "The truth, carefully, in stages." Voss had been constructing this in his mind since the afternoon's clarity had settled over him, building it the way he built an operational plan, sequentially with contingencies, with a clear understanding of the likely failure points. Not the full theological complexity, not the inquisitorial classification framework. The essential facts, that there is a presence beneath this cathedral that is not the Emperor, that this presence has been real and not malicious, that the healings and the grace they have experienced are genuine in the only sense that ultimately matters. They happened, they were real, they were felt, and that the Emperor... He stopped. "And that the Emperor what?" Marn said quietly. Voss looked at the lamp between them. "That the Emperor, in his wisdom, permitted it. That for 60 years his servants were aware of this place, and no order of destruction came. That the silence was not oversight." He paused. "Whether that constitutes the Emperor's blessing, his mercy, his pragmatism, or something else entirely, that is a theological question I am not qualified to answer, and I would not presume to. But the fact of the silence is documented. It is real, and it means that whatever the congregation of Viridia's Hope has been participating in for 80 years, they were not abandoned while doing it." Marn made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. She pressed her hand over her mouth briefly, and then lowered it with the deliberate control of someone reasserting composure. "You are asking us," she said, "to tell 4 million people that they have been praying to the wrong God. Oh, and then to tell them that the right God knew and didn't stop them. And to somehow make that bearable." "Yes," Voss said, "that is exactly what I am asking." The silence that followed was long enough for the lamp to gutter once and recover. "It will break some of them," Marn said finally. "Yes. It will shake the faith of many more. Yes. Some will reject it entirely. Some will reject the Emperor. Some will become angry in ways that could destabilize the community. Yes, all of that is possible, probable, in varying degrees." Voss did not look away from the old man. "And the alternative is that in 30 days someone arrives here with the authority to simply erase the question, and the people of this world never know what was done to them or why. And the healings stop and the grace ends, and 4 million people are left with the absence of something they depended on, and no explanation for the loss. He let that settle. "I have weighed the options, Confessor. I would not be asking this of you if I had found a better one." Marn was quiet for a very long time. He looked in the lamplight like a man at the end of a long journey, who has arrived at a destination that is nothing like what he expected and is deciding whether to be disappointed or grateful. "How do we begin?" he said at last. They planned through the night. Voss brought Priya and Torvin into the operational space, and the five of them worked until the pre-dawn hours, constructing a framework that Voss privately acknowledged was the most delicate operation he had ever attempted, not because it required violence or secrecy or the complex logistical machinery of a military purge, but because it required truth, delivered carefully enough that it did not destroy the people receiving it. Marn would speak first. Or to the cathedral's senior clergy, 12 priests and deacons who had served the longest and whose steadiness would be the foundation everything else rested on. He would not tell them everything at once. He would tell them that there was a matter of profound theological significance that required their attention and their strength, and he would begin with what was certain and real. The presence was genuine, the healings were genuine, the grace was genuine. He would build the ground before he revealed what stood on it. Marn would coordinate with the cathedral's lay community, the thousands of volunteers and servants who formed the connective tissue between the formal clergy and the broader congregation. She knew them individually, knew which ones had the resilience to hear difficult things and help carry them to others, knew which ones would need to be reached gently and in private before any broader announcement. Priya would establish a Medicae support framework, drawing on the colony's existing medical infrastructure and supplementing it with what the inquisitorial courier vessel's facilities could provide. People whose faith was shaken needed sometimes practical care as much as theological counsel. Voss had seen it enough times to know that the body and the spirit failed together and recovered together, and that feeding someone and making sure they slept was sometimes the most pastoral act available. Torvin would secure the chamber, not destroy it, secure it. Voss had thought long and carefully about this. The chamber was evidence of the entity's presence, of its nature, of the 80-year relationship between Theta Serene and the people of Viridia's Hope. He did not know yet whether that evidence would be needed before the conclave, or whether the conclave's decision, when it came, would render the question moot, but he would not destroy what he did not have to destroy, and he would not act from certainty he did not possess. The plan was not perfect. Voss had never in 38 years constructed a perfect plan, because perfect plans required a certainty about outcomes that reality consistently refused to provide. What the plan was honest. It was the best available approximation of what these people deserved, not protection from a difficult truth, but support in carrying it. Dawn came gray and quiet over Varus Prime. The 6th hour bells rang as they always rang, deep and resonant, rolling through the stone of the cathedral and out across the city and into the amber fields beyond. Voss stood at the window of the operational space and listened to them and thought about the entity below. Patient, warm, deeply and entirely indifferent to what was about to happen to the architecture of faith that had sustained it for 80 years. He wondered if it understood what was coming, whether something that existed in the warp and fed on gratitude had any capacity to anticipate, to fear, to grieve. He wondered, not for the first time, whether it was capable of something that might be called love for the people who had sustained it. He did not know. He would probably never know. Sister Marn appeared at the door of the operational space, her coat on, her expression carrying the specific quality of someone who has made peace with a difficult thing and is ready to begin. "The confessor is ready," she said. Voss turned from the window. 30 days, 23 remaining. He had work to do. The first clergy meeting lasted 4 hours. Voss did not attend. He had made the deliberate decision to absent himself from the initial disclosure, not out of cowardice, but because the presence of an inquisitor in the room, where a community's foundational truth was being dismantled, would transform the experience from a pastoral act into an interrogation, and the people in that room deserved the former. He waited in the operational space with Torvin, who had already completed his initial survey of the chamber's access points and was now sitting with the stillness of a man who had learned that some waits could not be shortened by doing anything at all. Priya returned first, 2 hours into the clergy meeting, to update him on the Medicae framework's progress. She had interfaced with the colony's chief Medicae administrator, a pragmatic woman named Dovar, who had apparently required approximately 90 seconds to understand the situation's broad strokes and respond with the practical efficiency of someone whose entire career had been spent managing crises that nobody had planned for. Additional counseling resources were being quietly mobilized. The Pilgrim Infirmary was being prepared for increased intake. Dovar had asked no questions about inquisitorial jurisdiction, and Priya had offered no explanations, which suggested that Dovar either had excellent instincts or had been in this colony long enough to understand that some things were above her clearance and below her concern. When Marn emerged from the clergy meeting, Voss read the result in the old man's face before he spoke. Not catastrophe, not collapse. Something harder to categorize. The expression of a man who had watched 12 people he respected absorb a detonation and remain standing, which was both a relief and its own kind of grief, because it meant the detonation had been real and survivable, and the next ones would have to be too. 3 of them wept, Marn said, settling into the chair across from Voss with the careful movements of someone running on spiritual reserves. 2 became angry, one at me, one at the entity, which is perhaps the healthiest response available. 4 went very quiet in ways I will need to follow up individually over the coming days. The remaining 3, he paused, and something in his expression shifted towards something that might, carefully, be called wonder. The remaining 3 said that they had always felt something was different here, that the warmth had never felt quite like the Emperor's warmth as described in the standard liturgy, that they had prayed about it privately and arrived at a kind of peace with the difference without ever knowing what to call it. Voss considered this. They suspected, not consciously, not theologically, but yes, in the way that people sometimes know things before they have words for the knowing. Marn folded his hands. They are not destroyed, Inquisitor. They are shaken. There is a difference. Over the following days, the disclosure moved outward in careful concentric rings, from senior clergy to junior priests to the lay leadership to the broader community of cathedral volunteers, each ring prepared by the one before it, each disclosure shaped by what had been learned from the previous one. It was the most methodical pastoral operation Voss had ever witnessed, and he had been trained to appreciate methodology. Marn moved through it with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent 50 years learning how people broke and how they healed, and what the difference was between a wound that needed air and a wound that needed binding. There were casualties. Voss had expected them and was honest with himself about the fact that expecting them did not make witnessing them easier. A senior deacon named Prast, 22 years in service to the cathedral, received the disclosure on the 4th day and did not come to the next morning's observance, or the one after, or the one after that. Marn visited him 3 times. On the 3rd visit, Prast opened the door but did not speak. Marn sat with him in silence for 2 hours and then left. On the 6th day after his disclosure, Prast appeared at the dawn observance, standing in his usual place, not singing, his face carrying the specific blankness of someone reassembling themselves from the inside. He was still there at the midday bells, By the evening observance, he had his hymn book open. He did not look the same as he had. Voss did not think he would ever look the same. But he was there. There were others who did not come back, families who quietly packed and left the city, whose departure Voss noted in the civil records without intervening. He had no authority to compel them to stay, and would not have used it if he had. Faith broken and then rebuilt was one thing. Faith that needed distance to process was another. He hoped, without certainty, that distance would be enough. On the 12th day, Marin's daughter came to the cathedral. Voss learned of this afterward from Marin herself in the Pilgrim Gardens, where they had taken to meeting in the evenings. The daughter, her name was Isla, Voss now knew, 23 years old, 2 children, living in the northern settlements, had received the disclosure not from her mother, but from her community's local priest, and had traveled 2 days to Varus Prime to find Marin. What did she say? Voss asked. Marin was quiet for a moment, looking out over the gardens where the evening faithful still moved in their slow, unhurried procession. Fewer than before, the disclosures had begun, but present, still present. Some of them holding the change visibly, and some of them moving through it with a grace that Voss found, against all his professional instincts, genuinely moving. She asked me why I didn't tell her sooner, Marin said, and I told her I didn't know whether it would help or harm her, that I had spent 11 years being unable to decide. Marin paused. She said, her voice caught briefly, recovered. She said that she had been given her life back, that her children existed because of what happened at that altar, and that she would rather know the truth of it than carry a comfortable fiction, because the truth was that something had heard her mother's prayers and answered them, and that was real, and knowing its name did not change the reality of her breathing. Voss said nothing. He looked at the gardens. She's going to be all right, Marin said. I think most of them are going to be all right. Not unchanged, but all right. On the 19th day, 11 days before the conclave's window closed, Voss sat down and wrote his report. It was the most difficult document he had produced in 38 years of service, and he had produced documents that had condemned worlds and absolved heretics and ended careers. He wrote it in the precise, formal register of inquisitorial correspondence, and he did not soften anything, and he did not embellish anything, and he told the complete truth in the full knowledge that the complete truth might end his career and possibly result in his censure before the inner conclave, and potentially, in the worst outcome, his declaration excommunicate traitorous. He documented the entity, the chamber, the 60 years of inquisitorial awareness and deliberate inaction, his own investigation, its findings, or its conclusions. He documented the disclosure operation in full, its methodology, its casualties, its outcomes to date. He included Medicaid records, civil stability assessments, congregation attendance figures that showed a decline of approximately 18% from pre-disclosure levels, with a stabilization trend beginning on day 9. He included his theological conclusion in the final section, written with the careful precision of a man who understood he was saying something his institution was not fully equipped to hear. The Emperor's silence on this matter spans 60 years of documented awareness. I do not interpret this silence as oversight or institutional failure. I interpret it as a considered position by an entity whose understanding of faith, necessity, and the nature of warp phenomena exceeds the operational frameworks of the Ordo Hereticus by a margin that our documents are not large enough to contain. The congregation of Viridia's Hope did not worship the Emperor. They were, however, sustained by something that served his people in his name's absence. I have chosen to trust that distinction. I recommend this matter be reclassified from active purge consideration to monitored coexistence status, I pending further theological review by the highest available Scholastica Psychana authorities. I accept full responsibility for all actions taken during this investigation and their consequences. He transmitted the report on the 20th day, encrypted, on the frequency that Crane had used to warn him. Then he went to the cathedral for the midday observance and sat in the rear pew and listened to the choir, smaller now, some voices absent, but present, still present, arms still rising into the amber light with something that had not quite broken. And he waited. The conclave's response came on the 28th day, 2 days before the window closed. It was 3 sentences long. Report received and reviewed at senior level. No further action authorized at this time. Continue monitoring. Voss read it 3 times. Then he folded it and did not burn it, which was unusual for him, and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, against his chest. He found Mon in the library that evening. The old confessor looked up and read his face with the accuracy of 50 years of ministry. "Well," Mon said. Voss sat down across from him. He thought about 38 years, about the weight of impossible questions and the rarity of answers that felt like anything other than the least bad option. About a child called Isla who was alive and breathing in the northern settlements with 2 children of her own. About an entity patient and warm in the stone below them, still humming its slow heartbeat, unchanged by everything that had happened above it. About an emperor who had looked at this world for 60 years and chosen again and again to say nothing. "We continue," Voss said. Mon nodded slowly. He reached for his book. Then he stopped and looked at Voss with the pale, steady eyes of a man who had carried an impossible weight for 12 years and felt it, if not lifted, then shared. "Do you believe," Mon said quietly, "that the Emperor was merciful in allowing this?" Voss considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I believe," he said finally, "that mercy and the Emperor are not always the same thing. And I believe that on Viridia's hope for 80 years, something made sure they were." He paused. Whether that was the Emperor's intention or his permission or something he simply chose not to stop, I don't know. I'm not certain anyone does. Mon looked at the lamp between them for a long moment. "Perhaps," he said, "that uncertainty is itself a kind of faith." The 6th hour bells began, deep and resonant, rolling through the stone, out across the city, into the amber fields beyond. The same as they had always been, the same as they would continue to be for now, for as long as the conclave's 3 sentences held, and the entity below maintained its patient, warming hum, and the people of Viridia's hope kept finding their way, changed and shaken and all right, back to the pews. Voss listened until the last bell faded. Then he opened his cipher journal and began to write. Word count, 897. In the 41st millennium, truth is rarely clean, and mercy is rarely simple. What Aldrich Voss found beneath the altar of Viridia's hope was not the monster his training had prepared him for. It was something far more dangerous. Something that asked nothing, gave everything and left no fingerprints on the souls it touched. He spent 28 days deciding whether that made it sacred or profane, and arrived at the end at the only answer available to a man who has looked honestly at an impossible thing, both and neither, and something the Imperium has no word for yet. The congregation of Viridia's hope still prays. Their numbers have not fully recovered. Some voices are still absent from the choir. Some families did not come back. But the bells ring at the 6th hour as they always have, and the amber light still falls across the nave in its warm, patient bands. And somewhere beneath the altar, the stone still holds its slow light, still hums its quiet heartbeat, still receives what is freely given and gives back what is freely needed. The Emperor's silence continues. Perhaps it always will. Perhaps that silence is the most honest theology available in a universe this dark. Not the absence of care, but the presence of something too large for doctrine to contain. Isla breathes in the northern settlements. Her children play in fields that have always been, by the brutal arithmetic of the 41st millennium, slightly more abundant than they have any right to be. That is not nothing. That is perhaps everything. The Emperor protects. More stories await.